Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Book Club of California. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California. It's my pleasure to welcome you and start this program this evening. For those of you that are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books, and we host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California and Western history, and much, much more. Now, if you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to learn more, to join, or to donate. Now, in addition to supporting fine printing and the book arts, the book club has, since its very founding, been an important advocate for scholarship in and the appreciation for the history of California and the West. And that aspect of our mission remains very much alive to this day. And tonight, the book club presents the 7th Kenneth Karmiole Endowed Lecture on the history of the book trade in California and the West. Now, we will have time for an audience Q&A at the end of the lecture, and we'll try to take questions from you folks out there on Zoom using the chat and the Q&A functions, and from you here in the club rooms tonight. And now I want to introduce the president of the book club's board of directors, Terry Castaneda. She will acknowledge the generous benefactor for this important lecture series, and she will introduce our speaker. Terry?
Good evening, members and guests. We're so glad you could join us. I'm Terry Castaneda, president of the book club's board of directors. On behalf of the board and book club membership, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the 7th Kenneth Karmiole Endowed Lecture on the history of the book trade in California and the West. This perpetual lecture series has been made possible through the extraordinary generosity of longtime book club member and former Book Club of California board director, Mr. Kenneth Karmiole. Ken is a highly respected member of the antiquarian bookselling community. Founder and president of Kenneth Karmiole Bookseller since 1975, he is one of the most active and generous supporters of academic libraries and the bibliophilic community at large. Ken has established multiple endowments supporting rare book acquisition, research, lectures, and archival studies. Further, he has been a prodigious supporter of students working not only with the Book Club of California, but also with Rare Book School at the University of Virginia and at his alma maters, UC Santa Barbara and UCLA. Ken has served 3 terms on the national board of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America and received the Distinguished Alumni Award for 2011 from the UCLA Library and Information Studies Alumni Association. The Book Club of California, future scholars, and bibliophiles everywhere benefit by his generosity in establishing this perpetual lecture series. Please join me in thanking him for his extraordinary generosity. Seriously, thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Terry.
And now it's my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest lecturer, Jeremy Skinner, who will speak to us about the Western publishers Binfords Mort. Jeremy Skinner is library director for Curry Public Library in Gold Beach, Oregon. From 2001 to 2014, he worked as an archivist and librarian in special collections at Lewis and Clark College, where he processed collections, cataloged books, curated exhibitions, and collaborated on 3 volumes: The Literature of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, Jefferson's Western Explorations, and William Stafford, an annotated bibliography. Jeremy earned a master's degree in history, specializing in the history of publishing, and wrote his thesis on Binfords Mort Publishing Company. The seeds from which this company germinated were first planted by Peter and Maurice Binford while they were mere teens in Portland, Oregon. Here in 1891, they began printing and publishing a monthly magazine, marking the start of a long and influential career that culminated in Binfords Mort, a publishing house dedicated to the literature of the Pacific Northwest. Once the largest publisher west of the Mississippi, Binfords Mort fostered the growth of regional literature, literary societies, recreation, and civic engagement. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jeremy Skinner.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. I would like to start by thanking Kenneth Karmiole for endowing this lecture and for the book club for inviting me. And I also want to make a special thank you to Charlie Seluzicki. Charlie died in 2024. He was a bookseller in Portland, and Charlie actually recommended me for this talk some time ago, I think. And Charlie taught a class at Portland State called Archaeology of the Book. And I took that class while I was working on my master's in history. And as I'm going to talk about with this project, finding manuscript collections to work with was difficult. And Charlie coached me in finding materials, but also looking at books as the artifacts themselves and interpreting them. So big thank you to Charlie. As mentioned, I'm a public librarian, and this going back in time for me, I still collect, but I really have not given this presentation in a long time, and it was really interesting to think about this after that amount of time. And so I may have some new things to say. When I was at Lewis and Clark College, we were working with literary collections, and I was using books by Binfords and Mort as reference materials, and they caught my eye when I was using them. They were, they seemed to me that they were kind of amateurish, but the material in them was really good. And the name, of course, was memorable. And so when I went to graduate school, I trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I talked to my advisor about it, and it really became a question of whether or not I could find the materials. And so my thesis, I finished my coursework. I started in about 2007, I think, and I had my coursework done mostly in about 3 years, but I did not get my thesis done until 2011 because I was still pulling materials together and trying to put this together the way I really wanted it to be. This is a picture of my home library, and this is mostly materials published by Metropolitan Press / Binford and Mort. They had a couple of names, and I'll explain that in a little bit. The publishing records themselves, what happened was the business was started as a job printing business in the 1890s. Became a publishing company in the 1930s while continuing to be a job printer. And then multiple generations, the business got passed down to a second generation. And then after the second generation, it was sold in the 1980s to a family that was going to continue to run it as a business. And the woman who was a partner in that business was still alive when I was working on my thesis. And I worked very hard to try to get access to the records, and she would not grant me access. And I worked with some booksellers that knew her, and it just became impossible. And actually, one of the things that since then I've worked with some publishers who are trying to reprint the materials and find documentation on the rights. And even that has become problematic because there, at this point in time, appear to be no records. And so one thing we're unclear on is whether or not she actually had those records or not. I'm still out there looking for them. So if any of you get a lead on them, you've got a client. So the Binfords, they started printing really young. this is the Northwest Pacific Farmer, an issue of it. This newspaper magazine was purchased by their adopted father, who was their sister's husband. So their parents died when they were young. They came across on the Oregon Trail with their sister and Frank Lee. Frank Lee first bought the Goldendale Tribune, which was in Goldendale, Washington, just east of the Cascades. Like a lot of newspapers, it burned down. And they moved to Portland. And while they were in Portland and still boys, they bought this press right here, this Excelsior hand platen press, for $25 and began selling subscriptions to their magazine, which they called The Young American. And then my sources that I had, which were mostly them telling their story later on after they had become successful, was that they couldn't really sustain the magazine, and there was a lot of work that went into that, and they wanted to make money. So they went to a sheriff's auction and purchased the rights and equipment to the Metropolitan Printing Company in a bankruptcy auction in 1899. And so that would have been the official beginning of the Metropolitan Press. The photo on the right there is one of the printing presses that they had. They moved around Portland quite a bit, trying to find a permanent home, and eventually built their own building. Peter Binford was the older of the two brothers, and Peter was the one that specialized over time in typography and layout and design of the books. His brother Maurice was more on the business side of things. And before we get into the publishing, I just want to talk a little bit about their job printing business. From 1899 to 1930, their only business was job printing, and they were a part of a small group of job printers in Portland. And the interesting thing that I discovered when I was working on my thesis was, first of all, I have some items up here. And one of the items up here is a journal from I can't remember what year it is, but it talks a little bit about them selling books, Tom Binford going on a book sale to sell books. And then I was also able to find at Reed College some journals from Peter Binford, talking about the World War I era and how much work they were doing. So they really weren't overwhelmed with work. It came in waves. They had some big contracts that kept them in business, but the other thing that kept them in business was that in Portland, there was this group, this Franklin group, that fixed prices for print jobs. So basically, if you went to a printer that was a part of that, and they were all a part of that, and the reason they was so that they could get paper prices at the right price. They were controlling paper prices, and if you weren't a part of it, you were going to have to pay far more for paper. So what would happen is, if somebody went into the business and requested a job, they would get a quote, and if they went to get a second quote before they would get there, the other printer would have contacted the other printer and said, here's what the price is, you can't go under that. So they were a part of that group, which gave them a little bit of protection. And so they were doing okay with business, and they printed everything that you can imagine, advertising. There's a little book here that is a guide to, I think it's engineers in Portland. They also did some books. This is one of the things that I talk about in my thesis, but because there were no real publishers for hyper local material, these job printers were by default printing books. There was a lot of vanity press work going on, some of it extremely interesting. The book on the right is Human Sterilization by Bethania Owens Adair. She was one of the first female doctors in Oregon, and was also an advocate of eugenics and actually petitioned the legislature to enact eugenics laws, which they did not, but that's a pretty important historical book. And that one was printed by Metropolitan Press, paid for by Bethany Owens Adair. And this is a much later job printing that they did. I threw this in here because it really got, once they became publishers, it got confusing because for a while, they were saying that they were Metropolitan Publishing Company or Metropolitan Press on the books that they were paying to publish. But at the same time, they were putting Metropolitan Press on some of their job work. And then they'd be printing things like this for Frank Robinson, who was a con artist. There's a really interesting book that came out of Washington State University about him. He was selling correspondence courses that he called Psychiana, and eventually the federal government got him for mail fraud. So just to be clear, they were job printers starting in 1899. In 1930, they decided that they were going to publish. They wanted to publish Pacific Northwest books. And that would have been, they would be paying for all of that. They'd be paying the author. So there was some risk involved with that. But they kept the name Metropolitan Press. I will refer to the publishing company primarily as Binfords just for clarity. In 1937, some of their books were being distributed on the East Coast by William Morrow, and Morrow said, your publisher name is generic and it's not very good. Come up with something else. And they came up with Binfords and Mort. I'm not sure that they cleared that with Morrow, but so the first book that they published as a publisher was Marooned in Crater Lake by Alfred Powers. And Alfred Powers was a pretty important early figure in their publishing business. He not only was the author of the first book that they published, but he also recommended a lot of the books that they did publish. He was the head of the Oregon University Extension Program, which was based in Portland. And he was very interested in all things Oregon Trail, whether it be fiction or history. This book right here, Genevieve by Frederick Homer Balk, was a book that had been burned by Balk. He wrote Bridge of the Gods in the 1800s and decided that this book was a failure, and his sister rescued it and hid it, and eventually it got passed along to Alfred Powers, published after Balk's death. And then the other book up here that I just wanted to point out, this one is some poetry by Balk. This one was published at University of Oregon by Tom Binford, the son of Peter Binford, while he was a student. And he was actually in John Henry Nash, who you're familiar with, worked at University of Oregon for a while. And so Tom Binford was one of Nash's students. And so there's actually a book up here with Tom Binford's book plate that was created as a school project under John Henry Nash. But really, 1930, really, you're going to start a publishing business in Portland in 1930. And the big question is why and how were they able to survive and be successful? And the part of the key to that success was getting rights to books that had been in print for a long time and just reprinting them and repackaging them and selling them. Astoria and Captain Bonneville by Washington Irving went through so many printings by Binfords that they were still being printed in the 1980s. The Empire Builders was a Doubleday book, and the Binfords got the rights to that and eventually published some more Robert Ormond case books. But I do have a copy up here of the markup. They had taken Doubleday copy and marked it up and prepped it and added a new chapter. So this was what part of what they did was they took these older books and repackaged them. General History of Oregon. Carey had paid to self-publish this book, and then they reissued it in multiple editions. And then in 1937, they became Binfords and Mort, and this was their logo, which is based on a statue at the state capitol in Salem of Jason Lee riding a horse, and early texting and driving. This is the first imprint with the Binfords and Mort name on it and the Circuit Rider logo. So as I noted, as was noted in the intro, all of this did build, and part of it, they became by the 1950s, the largest publisher west of the Mississippi. Now, there weren't too many publishers west of the Mississippi for one, but really, how was that possible? Is it what really became a part of my question of my research. And the Works Progress Administration was a big part of this, actually. So Alfred Powers had a connection to the Works Progress Administration, as did a lot of their early authors. And so I know that the first guidebook was the Idaho Guidebook, and Vardis Fisher got Caxton the ability to publish that. I know, and that's a pretty wild story, but as a result of Vardis Fisher opening that door, Binford's got the rights to Washington, Nevada, Oregon, and Provo guidebooks, which were cash cows for them. They went through multiple editions. In addition to that, the connections with the authors became very important, and the work that they had done. Some of the reference books that they published were based on research and note cards and information that they assembled during their work with the WPA. And just as a side note, probably my favorite book in my collection, which isn't here, is a book that was issued in 30 copies for the dedication of Timberline Lodge. I assume that most of them went to the Roosevelt administration. They had hand-colored plates by Ray Atkinson, who was a photographer. Mine is missing some of the plates, which is probably why I have it. But they leaned in heavy to pioneer historical romance. This is partly because, I mean, they really tapped into their audience, and this was something that I was trying to wrap my head around when I was writing, is that we tend, from the perspective today, to think about, we pick out these books as the high points in literature. None of these were the high points in literature, but they were the books that sold. And the reason that they sold was that there were still people that came across on the Oregon Trail that were alive, and their kids were really interested in knowing those stories. And so really they were the publisher that kept these stories alive. Also in historical form. So here's a variety of some of the history books. And by the way, there's probably between 700 and 1,000 books that they published between 1930 and 1980. So there was a lot of content put out there. They did a lot of what I would consider pretty important histories of things like the Oregon Journal. Like, this is the only real book on the history of the Oregon Journal, a newspaper. So it's just really interesting for me to look at these, just a huge range of different things. Opal Whiteley, one of the more interesting stories in Oregon history too. This book probably isn't very well vetted or footnoted, and this was my problem when I was working. I would see these books and I just really had to it was like they were oral histories almost. There wasn't some of these books, the only place this information came from are these books, but it's not footnoted. So um, they did maritime history, they did county histories, and a guide to how the government works, county governments in Washington state. So some of this, the Century of Coos and Curry is the county where I live. That book, probably most of the content was assembled during the WPA. So again, you can kind of see where a lot of this content is coming from. But for many of these counties in Oregon, these are the only historical works that have ever been written on their counties. Also cities, granges, ferry sites on the Willamette River, histories of universities and colleges. And this is one that if you look at the history of university presses, they came in at a really good time. The university presses in Oregon were primarily just printing monographs of research. They were not publishing books. And so whether it be the histories of the colleges or actual books by academics that needed a publisher but really weren't going to make it, find a publisher beyond the region, they Binfords would print those. Quite a bit of Native American history with quite a range of accuracy, and the Cathlamet on the Columbia was published the first year in 1930, and Cathlamet was written by an ethnologist. A lot of these are more amateur histories. And poetry. This is Howard McKinley Corning. He was one of the WPA project leaders and a poet. And Mountain in the Sky, his book was also published that first year, 1930. But he was responsible for bringing in a lot of these other poets. And, you know, as far as I can tell, poetry's not very good. But it would not exist in print form if it wasn't for Binford and Mort. They did do in the early years some nice printing. There's really a range of skill employed in this. I put this slide up here just to show that, and this is definitely a Peter Binford layout. His son Tom, who trained with John Henry Nash, was not a great designer. And so eventually it moved into this sort of design, and the type inside the books became standardized, and it was very blocky and just really inelegant. But
The coverage set, it's meant to be displayed out.
yeah, and as far as selling the books, the other thing that the Binfords had going for it was the J.K. Gill Company in Portland had a big Pacific Northwest section, and so they featured strongly at J.K. Gill. So yeah, I mean, some of these are outrageous and maybe just to catch the eye.
That was typical.
Reference Oregon geographic names, Dictionary of Oregon History, History of Oregon newspapers, History of Oregon literature, which isn't on here, guides to the study and reading of history of the Pacific Northwest. All really important books that are really the only of their kind in Oregon, and are still in reference sections in libraries, although probably they're now Google searchable, but they moved into tourism related books. trail guides, information maps. They did issue quite a few maps. And then natural history. This is really where the university presses now, or specialized presses would be doing these kinds of things, but those just didn't exist. So things like the Ferns of the Northwest, and Roadside Flowers of the Pacific Northwest, wildlife, nature trails, Indian relics, geology, angling, all things that they issued. And then they got into children's books, and this has actually been part of my collecting challenge, is tracking down the children's books, because these just didn't survive. And I've been really lucky with my collecting. When I was working on my thesis, I did have booksellers in Portland that were specifically on the lookout for things. And I did have one bookseller in particular who bought an entire collection from the secretary of the company. When they, for all stuff from 1930 all the way up into the 40s, and it was all in jackets, all inscribed to her by the authors, and they had never been read, and they were not sun faded. I think they must have been in boxes, I don't know, but they are almost like they just came off the press.
Do you have those?
I have them, yeah.
bought-
I bought them, yeah. Yes, I bought them. Yeah, and this one is also one of my favorites, the Little Pal Paint Book, which is basically a color book, just on paper. I don't know how that survived, but more children's books. These are more chapter books. Again, a focus on nature, focus on the Pacific Northwest. And this is Ben-Hur Lampman, who was an editor at the Oregonian. And I did want to make the point that they were pretty smart about who they chose to publish. It helped to get the publisher on in the Oregonian on your side as far as book reviews. And you know, as far as the content that they published, whether it was good quality reading material or not, there was some, and this one is one that I like. This one, the loop was 13 different authors. They passed each chapter off, and there was no plan, and they had to figure out how to make a coherent book. Disillusion is a book about labor in the mills in Washington State. And I am not an expert on labor literature, but it's my understanding that this is a pretty important book on the fiction, but about the labor movement. And I flew through that, and I'm really trying to not go over time here. So what did I learn while working on this project? I guess what I learned was their business was successful for a lot of reasons. Their business was successful because they had this network that was related to WPA. They quickly figured out that their audience wanted to know about the Oregon Trail and the pioneer movement, and so they got books like Washington Irving that they could reprint and keep reprinting and selling. The WPA guidebooks helped pay the bills. They and then once they brought in the additional content, it was content that they could that connected to the Oregon Trail story essentially, and so that Oregon Trail story got stretched out probably longer as in terms of viability as their audience was getting older, but they kept those books out there. By the time Tom Binford took over, he continued in that vein, and I think that not going in a different direction with their content, combined with kind of looking dated, and it just, the business kind of faded. But those books are still really important, so many of them, in terms of being some of the only materials on their subject. So I think with that, I will take questions. Yes.
I've done a book, sorry. How many of those books?
If you can be a
How
little
many of
louder.
them were relatively small paper, these really small, like 64-page paperbacks? Were they in that market, or were they all hardback books without a paper component?
They were almost all hardback. Until probably the 1960s, and then they started reissuing some of the ones that had come out. They weren't straight to paper. Until they did become straight to paper in the 70s and 80s. But they weren't pocket. They were just perfect bounds.
These are like large books. Were these relatively modest books, like under 125 pages, something like that?
The paper ones? Yeah.
No, or even these other hard.
Oh, most of these are full-size books. I did actually, it's funny because I really didn't bring too many Binford and Mort books. I brought mostly the early stuff, and manuscript related stuff, but yeah, 200, 300 page books mostly.
Oh, okay, got it.
And they did, I think probably by the 1970s, stop issuing books in jackets sometimes. They would just have pictorial boards. Yes.
I'm curious who Mort is.
Right. Sorry, I blew by that, didn't I? So before they became a publishing company, knowing that they were going to embark on that, they hired on their nephew, Ralph Mort, and Ralph took over the job printing side of things. And one thing to note also, as far as the viability of the publishing company, the job printing business did take off even after they were publishers. So they got the contract for phone books in Portland for a while, and they were the only printer with the press capable of doing phone books and those sorts of things in Portland. So I'm sure that if I could see the financial records, which I haven't, but I'm sure that the printing business was subsidizing the publishing business to a certain degree. Yes.
You mentioned that one special publication of 30 copies.
Yeah.
Did they also do other limited editions? One of 100 signed by
Yeah.
the author,
Yeah.
kind of thing?
Yeah. So this one right here, this was the Marooned in Crater Lake, which is the first book that they published. This one was a limited in Myrtlewood covers. Now the colophon on this says, I thought it said how many were printed. Somewhere in here it says that it was in an edition of like 300 copies, but here we go, 300, but there's no way they did 300 of these in Myrtlewood. I just don't see it. And I mean, I look for these, and I've only come across about 3 of them over the last 20 years for sale.
I was just curious, were there other publishers, either of similar size or specialty publishers during this period?
Caxton would have been the really close. Caxton, you've heard from
Yeah.
presenter on Caxton, but I believe that Caxton did pretty well with textbooks, was part of what their business model was, and the Binfords didn't really get into that quite as much, but very similar in a lot of the content that they published. And then in Washington State, there was a little bit different, but the Superior Publishing Company, which did Washington history kind of stuff, but at a much smaller scale than Caxton and Binfords.
Thank you.
The Dogwood Press also, I think of in Seattle.
Okay.
And how about, where does Arthur Clarke fit in terms of the publishing when they came out to California?
Right. I'm trying to, so Arthur Clarke was in Ohio first, and I'm not sure.
I think maybe the forties they came out to
Okay.
Pennsylvania. I'm not positive about that, but they were pretty
Yeah,
prolific in
yeah.
Western history.
Oregon Trail stuff, but I mean, and I don't, they felt to me, and I more academic. So,
So you mentioned that Peter Binford was involved with the design of the books, but we saw all kinds of illustrations on the covers of the books. Were they also illustrated inside, and where did they find their illustrators?
they found their illustrators all over. I did have the good fortune of Richard Mort, who was the son of Ralph Mort, was still alive when I was working on this project. And I had about 2 hours. Well, I met with him twice. I probably had about 4 hours with him and tried to pick his brain on that. His wife did a jacket for them. So, I mean, I think that and he said she didn't get paid, and he was a little bitter about that. So, I mean, I think that they had an in-house binder. One of the things I didn't mention, they were also, as far as their process goes, and it makes it really interesting as a bibliographer, they printed pretty large print runs of these materials, relatively large, but they didn't bind them all. And so they would stash the printed sheets away, and then when they were ready, they would bind more of them. And so I have like that history of Oregon by Carey, which is a 2-volume. I've seen something like 6 different bindings versions of that book, and I know that I can't tell a difference at all from the pages. They look to be the exact same edition, but completely different bindings. But they did have an in-house binder. But as far as illustration and artwork, in the early years, they worked with a handful of illustrators, particularly for the kids' books. But for the regular jackets, I think they were trying, for the most part, to go cheap.
Sort of a short addenda to that, one wonders how big a town Portland was during the 30s and 40s, because one has the feeling that there were several groups of printers in town, but this was much more informal. It wasn't like New York, where everybody was competing against each other and trying to aim for the highest quality and so forth and so on. So one sort of has a feeling that there was kind of a small town with interests that were local that probably hadn't been addressed, and they were there to do that.
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty accurate.
Can you tell us a little bit about how they marketed their books and then ultimately were sold?
Early years, Morrow put them on their distribution list. And so that was one way. They primarily in the newspapers, they had a pretty strong presence in the Oregonian as far as being reviewed. And they did have pretty good distribution for the kids' books and for the civic related books and the history books, like to schools. They issued catalogs, but one of the interesting things that I came across was schools eliminating their libraries or really seriously thinning down their libraries while I've been working on this project. And so have been able to come across some of their books that have been removed from school libraries. So I can kind of see that, in fact, the school in the town that I'm in, the elementary school library, just as of like a year ago, I haven't been in there recently, still had books that shocked me that were like, from the 40s from Binfords. So yeah.
So
That's the way a library should be.
So is there like a comprehensive bibliography of the 700 to 1,000 titles that you mentioned that were?
Well, the back of my thesis, I tried to put a listing, as I've been collecting I have a private list that I've been building. And so it's kind of funny because I can't, usually when I'm out, I don't have a list. I can't carry that 1,000 title list around with me. And so I don't buy something unless I've really never seen it. It doesn't ring a bell for me at all because I assume I already have it. And usually when I do that, I'm buying something that's not on my list at all, that I really haven't seen before. So no, there isn't. I've thought about trying to do something like that, but I haven't.
That leads to the last question here on Zoom is there a book in mind for you for the Binfords and Mort story that might end with this bibliography?
Maybe. I mean, I did think that there would be at one point in time. I actually partly I had an idea that if I left academia and went into public libraries, I'd have more time to write. I was wrong. So I mean, I would like to at some point in time. I just really don't know when. I actually, what I would rather do though, I think, is tell the bigger story of the publishing and the book that I had in mind was too big. It was books, readers, and publishers in the Pacific Northwest. It's way too big. But I think that really what I would probably like to do would be the publishing side of it.
Any last questions, John?
So it sounds like what you're really describing, you actually probably could do that. Actually, when you have time, whatever. If you're talking about a very, very intense, very interesting, though not that eccentric form of regional publishing, a relatively defined area, and an area of pretty high literacy, because Oregon, at least historically, was kind of the really advanced area in the back in the 1850s and all that. And then Washington came along much later. But those were areas of high literacy.
Right.
And relatively good schools.
Right.
So one of the things is, have you looked at the library? I mean, you must have consulted the Library of Congress. These were all on copyright. Did they copyright almost everything?
Binfords?
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe not some of the reprints, because that might have been one thing.
Right.
Those are easy to do.
It's messy. They did a really bad job with some of this stuff.
They didn't record it.
Some of it they did, but Washington State University Press was looking to reissue some of these things, and they were having a hard time tracking down that information.
No listings else.
Yeah.
Well, to get copyright, you had to give the books in.
Yeah, I mean,
Or did they not care?
I'm not sure. That's a really good question that would need to be looked at. I don't know. I just know that the folks that are working at the academic presses right now, that really some of these are pretty, for example, there were two kids' books that were they were photographs taken at Celilo Falls, at the Celilo Village, the Native American village. And they're pretty important documentary information, but they were issued as kids' books to show what a Native American festival might look like. But they didn't pay the Native Americans, and whether or not they had, what kind of permissions they had is unclear. And so Washington State University, but they are important, and Washington State University really wanted to sort this out and reissue them, but trying to figure that out became a real problem.
So many questions to still be answered that we cannot answer tonight. But you can all join me in thanking our speaker. And again, let's thank our benefactor for this lecture series, Kenneth Karmiole. Speech. You want to make a speech? No, I'm going to jump on here just to say goodbye to everyone. And thank you all for joining us here in person and out there on Zoom for this presentation. Please join us for another book club program, either online or in person in the future. You can register for all of our events online at bccbooks.org/programs, or you can respond to the emails that you're probably getting from us in your inbox and RSVP for a program. Thanks again for everyone coming for tonight, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone.